Hello and welcome to my podcast Error 1 Daily Error. I'm Eckhard Jan and I'm delighted that you're listening to the very first English episode of my podcast. History is full of tiny missteps that spiraled into catastrophic disasters. From overlooked details that led to engineering failures to simple human errors that changed the course of history. Error 1 uncovers the moments where the small mistake made all the difference. We all make mistakes. Some are big and some are small mistakes, but sometimes the small error turns into big disaster. Join us as we explore the real stories behind these errors, why they happened, and what we can learn from them. Because sometimes the biggest lessons come from the smallest mistakes. That's why I think it's so important that we learn from all of them. And that's the aim of my podcast. I want to inspire you to explore and understand the causes of errors. This will enable you to recognize error chains, to interrupt them early on, and thus prevent the consequences. I wish you every success in doing so.
Hello, Mr. Miller. How are we doing today?
A nurse comes into the room in the morning and checks on her patient. This happens every day 1,000 times in clinics and hospitals all over the world. Mr. Miller is not well. Not well at all. A doctor is called. On the surface, there are no abnormalities. But on closer examination, however, it is discovered that the patient has internal bleeding in his stomach. In an emergency operation, they were just barely able to save Mr. Miller's life. But what had happened? You'll find out in a moment. First, let's take a look at what an error chain actually is. An incident, a disaster, or a catastrophe is not triggered by a single error or a single cause, but it is the result of several events and incidents that follow one another and build upon each other. It usually starts with a small trigger, a small cause that may seem harmless at first. One after the other, however, errors accumulate and the chain of errors is set in motion. Think of it like a long row of dominoes. The first domino topples and the others follow ultimately until the end. These can be just a few errors, a small error chain for example, or it can be a large number of mistakes that only become a very long chain of errors and when they are combined and strung together. And in the end, it leads to a major disaster or catastrophe. So how should we deal with it? And this is the topic that has been on my mind for many years. Far too often, companies look at the end of the error chain as the last element, the last link in the error chain. It is the person who acted or perhaps made a final mistake at the last moment that led to the accident or incident, and this person is held responsible. As soon as the guilty person has been found and punished, it is back to business as usual. In English, it is called blaming and shaming. The problem seems to be solved. Unfortunately, this is almost never the case. The real causes lie much deeper. And this leads to several problems for the company, because if the error chain is not traced back to the beginning, the real problems cannot be identified and eliminated. They persist and can continue to cause damage even further in the future. The second problem is the way in which error chains can develop. This is because error chains do not always follow the same course. Even if it was the same trigger, they can lead to different subsequent errors or effects. The result at the end of the error chain could be completely different from the first case. Again, we need to think of it like a long row of dominoes we talked about earlier. But now, the rows of dominoes branch out even more and take different directions. In the end, they can end up in very different places. You probably know this from the Domino World Championships, or Domino Days, as they used to be called. If you only look at the end of the domino row, you never know which tile triggered the chain. This example makes it clear why it is extremely important to look at the beginning of the error chain. I refer to the beginning as the error 1, the first mistake or trigger that sets the error chain in motion. Because Let's not kid ourselves, there's always cause and effect. And everything begins for a reason. So, what is the error 1? In an epidemic or pandemic, it is immediately clear to many that the start of the infection must be found in order to effectively interrupt the spreading of chain of infections. Colloquially, this is referred to as patient 0, or more correctly, the index patient. For doctors, this is everyday life, the patient where the spread of disease has begun. What is common practice for the spread of diseases is unfortunately done far too rarely in the case of error chains. Companies, organizations, or superiors usually leave it at that once they have found someone to blame. This is where they usually stop looking. But as already explained, this actually makes matters much worse. When I have my first conversations with customers, I usually ask them what they did when it was clear that the employee had made a mistake. I often get the answer,
"We spoke to him and made it clear that this must not happen again."
Of course, this immediately implies that the employee knowingly and deliberately made this mistake. In the case of the medication mix-up, this would be comparable to the nurse closing her eyes and arbitrarily taking a medication from the box. That is, of course, absurd. Nobody does something like that deliberately and knowingly, apart from a few exceptions perhaps. But we as humans have the intention to do a good job. We don't leave the house in the morning and say, let's see if I can crash the plane today and overshoot the runway. And finally, I'm sure you'd like to know what happened to the fictitious patient of Mr. Miller. The subsequent examination revealed that the patient had been given the wrong medication. A classic medication mix-up. And to make matters worse, he was taking blood thinners which, in combination with the wrong medication, led to gastric bleeding. We had investigated the medication mix-up in detail in terms of the error chain. It subsequently emerged that the nurse had indeed taken the correct packaging, but the wrong blister was inside, so it had already been packed wrongly and incorrectly before, or maybe even worse, or incorrectly packaged at the pharmacy or the production company. And now we could prove that the error 1 was much earlier. We were able to trace the error chain back almost to its origin, and in cooperation with the supplying pharmacy, had taken countermeasures to prevent such errors in the future. Not only for one medication, but for the rest as well. And this is the great value of error 1. This brings us to the end of the first episode of the Error 1 podcast. I'm delighted that you have listened and hope that you have learned something new, insightful, and interesting. And don't forget to subscribe to my podcast so you will never miss an episode. If you want to learn more about this concept, you can now download my award-winning book, Error 1. Just click on the link below in the description. With this in mind, I say thank you very much for listening, and as we say in Germany, bleiben Sie sicher, stay safe, and talk to you next time. Bye-bye.